Welcome to the Foreign Affairs podcast on the spot, zooming in the world. My name is Jovan Jovanovic. I'm former Serbian ambassador to Indonesia, 7 Southeast Asian countries, and also former member of Serbian National Assembly. It's a great honor and pleasure to host today Ambassador Gurjit Singh, one of the leading foreign affairs analysts, and I would say one of the most prolific foreign affairs commentator in India, former Indian ambassador to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, the African Union. Ambassador Singh, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Well, thank you for having me, Jovan.
Thank you again. And today we will discuss three important topics, 3 important events that took place in the first half of July that have serious consequences also for India, but I would say also to various extents globally. First is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Astana in Kazakhstan. The second one is annual summit between Russia and India, Prime Minister Modi, President Russia summit. And the third one is the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the 75th anniversary, particularly NATO's intention to expand its presence in the Indo-Pacific. So let's start first with the first event, which took place from 3rd to 4th of July in Astana, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is for the first time since India joined in 2017, if I'm not wrong, that Prime Minister Modi didn't attend the summit. So what were the reasons for not attending the summit this year?
Thank you. Well, let me first explain how India views the current world disorder. There is disruption. Some of it was natural, like COVID. But subsequent disruptions through the Ukraine crisis, the Gaza crisis, are entirely man-made and mismanaged international relations. So instead of dealing with climate, world trade, and globalization, we are dealing with issues of war and humanitarian existence and destruction of people and infrastructure. This world is becoming more and more bipolar. The United States and its allies on one side, and China efforts to rally allies behind it. India feels uncomfortable in this. India believes that we need a multipolar order. And in this multipolar order, yes, there is the United States, there is China, but there's also Russia, there is Europe, there's Africa, there's Latin America, there's Central Asia, and there's ASEAN, among others. And yes, we thought that the Quad countries, particularly India, Japan, and Australia, would be another pole in this multipolar order. The way that China is trying to bulldoze its way into running the international order in a manner it thinks is beneficial to it means that organizations like SCO, BRICS, and other arrangements are now not running on a multipolar basis, but are running on a unipolar basis. So when India joined SCO, the idea was that India's relationship with Russia, which was good, would expand to give more momentum to its relationship with Central Asia. You know, we have the North-South transport corridor in which we worked with in Afghanistan to give it a link. We are working with Iran. So when SCO became bigger, and now Iran is a member since last year, and last year to 2023, India was the chair. But we held the meeting virtually. We did not hold it physically, though we could have. But Iran entered that, and now Belarus has entered. So with Iran, Afghanistan as the observer, and with the Central Asians, it gives you an alternative transport route to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is the leading BRI corridor and which violates India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So there is an area of Kashmir which Pakistan is illegally occupying, and part of it has illegally ceded to China. And therefore, India does not condone the CPEC, nor does it condone BRI. So this is one issue, that the multipolar order is being disrupted by China. Second, the BRI is infringing on India's integrity. And the third, China upset the rules of engagement of over 20 years, which had held the peace between India and China on the border in 2020 by intruding heavily into parts of India and forcing India to bring in 50,000 troops to counter China. So the border is more militarized than ever before. 14 rounds of military negotiations have not led to a solution, and Chinese refuse to go back to their pre-2020 positions. The Chinese are very clear that they want the order to look like their shadow, and independent poles in Asia like India, ASEAN, Japan should not be allowed to exist. So all of us are under Chinese pressure, including India. And finally, China wants to expand its navy and become a more potent force in the Indian Ocean, directly challenging India. Now, these are 3 or 4 reasons where the India-China relationship is not looking good. And our worldview and regional view is not congruent. Therefore, for Prime Minister Modi to go to SCO had no strategic value. At the same time, the Indian Parliament had just been re-elected, and the first session of the Parliament was on at the same time. So it would not have looked good for the Prime Minister to be missing from the opening session of Parliament at this time. So domestic plus regional issues meant that India did not go. The SCO is becoming an area where either Russia and China manage the region, but they are showing signs of competition. Russia wants Chinese support in the Ukraine crisis. The cost of that is China wants to supplant Russia in Central Asia as the primary power. And they use the SCO for that. So therefore, India, last time, as I said, we were the chair, so we had to host it. But this time we really did not see any merit in going there. The next meeting of SCO at the level of heads of government will be in Pakistan. I'll be very surprised if an Indian leader went there, maybe a minister. And after that, China takes over the chairmanship. So the next summit like this next year will be in China. Now, unless any of these 4 or 5 ideas that I have mentioned show improvement, I don't see any reason for India to engage China. The problem is that China believes that India has perhaps become too big for its boots. It is becoming influential in its own right. Its economy is growing rapidly. And the United States and Western countries want to use India as a bulwark against China. The mistake they make in this is that they do not value India's strategic autonomy. In fact, they don't recognize. They think if India is not with them, India is with the West. That is a total misunderstanding of India. So this is the problem with China. Now the SCO has functional benefits for India. Its anti-terrorism mechanism, we benefit. So we participate in it through the level of national security advisors. We find that the connectivity issues are important, startups are important. We are dealing with functional issues. But at the summit level, I don't think India sees value in it. And therefore, we did not go to SCO. But we value our relationship with Russia. Therefore, a few days after that, when Indian Parliament had been prorogued, Prime Minister Modi went to Moscow.
So this is the first time after 3 years that meeting took place since the war in Ukraine started. So how would you assess the results of this summit, and what is the current state of the relationship between India and Russia, and what are the major projects between the two countries?
Excuse me. You know, Russia is one of India's long-standing partners. Since about 1955, when the Western countries put conditions on supporting India's development, the Russians came in open-heartedly. So much of India's public institutions in the economic side are actually Russian. Similarly, it happened on the defense side. That initially India's defense procurement was from Britain after independence. But slowly it moved to Russia because the Western countries would not transfer technology to it. So the defense relationship became the most important part of India-Russia engagement, because a large amount of aircraft, tanks, aircraft carriers, ships, submarines, all came from Russia. And there was a Russian willingness to transfer technology and jointly develop these in India. Secondly, India and Russia then had enough confidence to jointly develop the BrahMos cruise missile, which is a very potent, one of the world's better medium-range missiles. And that is a missile that India is now sold to the Philippines as a foreign trade. At one time, nearly 60 to 70% of India's defense requirements were met by Russia. In the last 20 years, this has been slowly coming down. It is not that India did not want, India wanted another aircraft carrier, but our experience with the last one was not great, so we let it be. There was a big deal signed to buy a large number of, I think, 200 plus Kamov helicopters. That deal has fallen through. The S-400 anti-missile systems, the Russians were committed to supply. We even challenged American sanctions and got some of it, but they have not been able to deliver all of it because of their own commitments in Ukraine. So there have been India's desire to diversify and the Russian inability to cope with Indian requirements, which have led to a diminishing of the India-Russia defense partnership. As a result, today, less than 40% of India's defense procurement comes from Russia. Much of the newer stuff comes from the United States, comes from France, and comes from Israel. More work is being done with Germany and Spain. But to be honest, there are not enough places you can buy everything Russia was selling us, and neither do you get the kind of transfer of technology that they gave us. So though we buy Rafales from France, there's not even one Rafale produced in India. But because we need fifth generation fighters, we are going along with that. Now, the defense relationship is very important. So that is one. Even before the Ukraine crisis, Russia felt that India was turning to the West and not buying enough from them. ignoring the fact that they couldn't supply what we wanted and they did not have that generation of equipment that we want. We did set up a rifle factory to produce AK-203s in India, but that factory has had so many problems that they are not able to get it off the ground. So there are issues with Russia. The second aspect is the strategic support Russia gave us. As Russia saw India diversify its strategic autonomy, they started dealing more with China and Pakistan, which are both enemies of India. Now, traditionally, Russia never supported them, but Russia felt this was good enough. So that created a bit of a gap. And Russia normally provided support to India in the UN Security Council. But today, Russia has so many of its own problems that I don't think it's supporting anybody. So today, France has become India's go-to partner for the UN Security Council issues than Russia. Next, you come to trade. India-Russia trade has never been big. It is from 2009 when I dealt with Russia to about 2014. India-Russia trade was between $9 and $12 billion. And you and I have both been in Indonesia. India's trade with Indonesia was double that. So therefore, Russia was not an important trading partner for India. Now, with Ukraine crisis, Russia has basically shot itself in the foot. And their relationship with Europe has come to an end. So just as India was prioritizing Europe, Russia was also prioritizing Europe, but we were not doing it together. So today Russia is isolated. So they need new markets, new areas to engage with. So they are engaging with China and India. Now, the biggest windfall has come through oil. Because of Western sanctions, the Europeans are not able to buy Russian oil and gas directly. So the $10 billion India-US trade in 2024 is $66 billion. Huge. And this is mainly because about 55 billion is oil imports by India. So India used the arbitrage available under Western sanctions. And Russia was never an important oil supplier to India. India's biggest suppliers were US, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Nigeria. But now Russia is among the biggest. This is because they have sought sanctions, they reduced their pricing, India became able to buy, and India bought a lot. Now, India did not buy only for itself. India has very large refining capacities, which have been invested for the last 20 years. So India has the ability to refine petroleum and sell products. So today, about 25% of diesel imports in Europe are actually coming from Indian refineries, most of it through Russian oil. So India has become a service hub for the oil industry. And I think inflation in the world would have been much bigger had India not stepped in and bought Russian oil, refined it, and sold it at controlled prices, despite sanctions. But this is a windfall. Besides oil, also fertilizers. India has also bought more Russian fertilizers because they couldn't sell it elsewhere. Now, India wants to develop this trade on a sustained basis. But supposing Trump comes to power, the Ukraine crisis ends, sanctions are lifted, is this oil trade going to continue? So what India is trying to do is invest in Russian oil facilities so that we become owners of that and we can continue, if not all, at least a large part of this trade. There is a very large trade surplus now that Russia has in India. And India and Russia do 40% trade in local currencies. So there is a large rupee surplus in India. What to do with that rupee surplus is very important. that can be used for investment, that can be used to fund, infrastructure in India. So this is something that we can do. India is trying to show interest in the Russian Far East. And in 2019, the last time Prime Minister Modi went to Russia, we took a large business delegation. We announced $1 billion credit line. But unfortunately, nothing has happened. This is because Indian private sector is heavily involved with the United States and Europe. And dealing with a sanctioned Russia puts them in jeopardy. So we don't have enough institutions or companies in India who don't deal with the West and therefore would not be impacted by sanctions. So that is the challenge India has. And we would like to enter the Russian Far East to challenge China and give it some competition. Strategically, we do not want Russia to become a Chinese junior. We want it to be an independent pole. Now, these are our requirements. Russia appreciates India that we have not sided with the West in criticizing Russia publicly on Ukraine, not voted in the UN against them. But Prime Minister Modi this time in Moscow and earlier at an SCO meeting in Samarkand has publicly said to Putin, this is not an era of war. You cannot settle such disputes on the battlefield. Humanitarian costs, particularly loss of civilian life, is unacceptable. I don't think any other leader would have the ability to be heard like this. And that is because there is a basic understanding between India and Russia. But was India trying to give a message to the West through this? I don't think necessarily. I think we were simply trying to build our relationship with Russia and trying to see how to develop technology, defense, security, economic partnerships and take them beyond. But as an analyst, I must say, we do not think that Russia has adequately rewarded India for the autonomous way in which India stood up to the West to prevent criticism of Russia. There is nothing that India has gained from Russia for that. India has not gained much from Russia economically. The oil trade is a matter of circumstance. We would like to see Russia use the rupee surpluses to invest more in Indian infrastructure, since you can't take away those. And Russia keeps saying there's not much we can buy from India. So Russia is, falling prey to its old fault lines. And worst of all, Russia is showing inadequate ability to stand up to China. In SCO, in BRICS, and the Russia-India-China trilateral dialogue has died. So there is nothing Russia is doing to stand up to China. So I gave you the Indian objective, but I must confess that there is unhappiness that Russia is not doing its bit to stand up.
Well, if I understood you well, there was also a criticism coming from the West about this India's desire to seek this global stability with Russia, which is one of the major global disruptors at the moment. But from what you said, I would say that it's in the West interest, these good relations between India and Russia is in the best West interest, particularly having in mind this dynamics within this triangle, China, India, and Russia.
So strategically speaking, the West needs to understand that in this strategic Eurasian triangle of Russia, India, and China, India is their best bet, strategically and economically. Secondly, from the time the Ukraine crisis started, initially the West criticized India for its stand in the UN. That criticism slowly became acceptance. And I think now there is appreciation that India is able to talk to Russia, mainly because of the international stand it took. But at times when India is talking to Russia or doing oil trade with Russia, even though the West benefits, they will do pro forma criticism. India has learned to live with that. So we know it's not serious. at the level of leaders, there is understanding that what we are doing is not pro-Russian, it is pro-Indian. But I think what we have understood from 2021, when the West withdrew from Afghanistan in a rush, handing over the country to arch enemy Taliban, means that NATO is not a dependable ally for India. We had invested billions of dollars in Afghanistan in consultation with NATO and the Americans to build the life for the Afghan people. So today, even though Taliban is there, India is trying to work with Iran and Central Asia to use those facilities of road and rail that India has invested in Afghanistan to create an alternative corridor to the CPEC. Now, the West does not want it, but it was created when the West was there. So you cannot switch on and switch off. So the lesson from Afghanistan, which we have learned, is that there is no strategic partnership which is global. It is on issue and region. So India and the US see eye to eye largely in the Indo-Pacific, but not in the Middle East, not in Central Asia, certainly not with Russia.
So now we came to this last topic, and we have a few minutes for that. You mentioned NATO, and this last week the NATO summit took place in DC, the 75th anniversary. And why is India wary of NATO's expansion to the Indo-Pacific?
India has always been against military alliance. You know, when NATO was formed in 1949, there was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in India. So India and Yugoslavia at that time, we pushed the Bandung Conference and then the non-aligned movement against such alliance. So India has not changed its position. But the world is disrupted. So today, the European pole has been subsumed under NATO. And the Ukraine crisis, while it has denuded Russia of its military industrial capacity, it has also shown the limitations of European military industrial capacity. They don't have enough. So today, they want more industrial capacity, especially from Japan and Korea. Not so much New Zealand or Australia.
The IP4.
So, yes, so IP4 comes in mainly to bring them into alliance. Now, all these four IP4 countries are US allies, not NATO allies. But the US, since 2022, is bringing them into the NATO summits, both summit and ministries, and now into defense production. So when NATO is encouraging military industrial complex in every NATO country, they are also encouraging it in the IP4. Up to this point, we have no problem, except NATO's projection is anti-Russian. Our projection is anti-Chinese. So the priority has to be different. Now, IP4 has individual countries, like India also. India has a good relationship with many NATO countries. We are exercising with them. We have our own military exercises coming up with many NATO countries, but not as NATO, as Germany, Italy, Spain, Russia, US and Japan. But not as NATO, because NATO brings European problems to the Indo-Pacific. And we don't think Russia and Europe's problems are our problem. Our problem is China. And that focus must not be lost. So Japan, Australia in particular also agree with us. But because they are US allies, they have to participate in this and in the Taiwan issue, of which again India is not a part. So this is where the hedging takes place, to keep priority on the Indo-Pacific and our own concerns with China and not letting the Taiwan issue get out. Thank you.
And maybe just briefly to answer the question, because we are just before the important presidential election in the US, do you think that possible Donald Trump's victory could change the global dynamics, weaken maybe NATO, and maybe contribute to the creation of the multipolar world, which is also India's goal?
India always remains hopeful that all developments will lead to a multipolarity in which India would play a role. The end of the Ukraine crisis will help multipolarity. So if Trump's victory leads to the end of hostilities in Ukraine and a peace conference and some way of finding peace, I think that will benefit everybody, and European autonomy, Russian autonomy will all come back, giving multipolarity a boost. A Trump victory may also bring more focus on China, which is again India's preference. Many countries are very uncomfortable right now in Europe and elsewhere with the possible return of Trump in January 2020. And I think they have changed a lot, but I think they're still on tenterhooks. I think the one country which is not concerned so much is India. Because you may recall that before the last presidential election, Trump was in India. And there was a huge public meeting in Ahmedabad with PM Modi, at which he said, my gosh, so many people love me in India. And they used this term, Agli Baar Trump Sarkar, which means next time a Trump government. But it did not happen then, but it could happen now. So with Trump, transactional relationships come to the fore. India knows that we will not benefit economically from the United States under Trump, but strategically we could benefit. And I think that is something we will manage.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Thank you, dear Gurjit. Thank you for this really excellent intervention and answering to the very important questions. And I would also like to thank our viewers for following our podcast and hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Thank you again, Ambassador Singh.
Thank you. A pleasure being with you. Goodbye.